Now that we've finished reviewing things like ground reaction force and torque and some basic biomechanical principles, now we want to actually jump into the app and start diving through some of those things that we can actually look at in golfers, how we look at it in the app, and then how that's actually related to the way that a golfer will move and produce their force and pressure in the golf swing. And where we're going to start is actually with pressure. Sometimes we focus a lot on the advanced nature of these 3D dual force plates, and while we love to look at ground reaction force and feel that it's a powerful piece of the puzzle, we also want to recognize that as we look at pressure distributions and overall center of pressure and the point of applications and pressure traces, that can actually really help coaches and players understand how they're producing their forces and actually help them create better motion and better golf swings. So just again, a quick reminder, pressure is not the same as force. Okay, pressure is going to give us a weighted average of kind of where a player is pushing on the ground. It's going to give us a pressure distribution. Is it more in the trail foot or lead side? Where is it at different points of the swing? What is that percentage of pressure distribution? And these are some of the things that we can look at in the swing, along with things like stance widths and foot flares and different things of that nature. So Tyler, let's maybe hop into the app and see where coaches can kind of start looking at these variables right in the app.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the app, in the top right corner, you'll see our pressure distribution and trace information. And one of the nice things I can do is simply double click that and it will make that full screen so we can see that all that information a little bit easier. And so I want to quickly just go through everything that we're seeing in this view so we can then kind of analyze it and talk about what we want to see. So the first thing to point out is that the blue dot is the center of pressure point for the lead foot or the left foot for the right-handed player. And the red dot is the center of pressure point for the right foot or the trail foot for the right-handed player. If you have a left-handed player, that simply just switches around. The yellow dot in the middle is the total center of pressure. And so as I move from my left foot to my right foot with the pressure distribution, you'll see both the percentages at the bottom change from left to right or blue to red, and you'll also see that yellow dot migrate from one side to the other. We can also view this in the 3D view here, which also adds the vectors. So as I move this around, I can see those vectors changing with the points of center of pressure as well. If we go back to the 2D view, we have some interesting information at the top of the screen as well. On the far left and the far right, we have our foot flare for each foot. So this is simply just looking at how much the foot is pointed in or out. If those numbers are positive, that means the feet are flared outwards. If it's negative, it's flared inwards. The next one from the left is our stance width. And this is exactly what it sounds like, just how far apart our feet are. The second one from the right is our stance alignment. So this is just looking at how our feet are positioned in relation to, say, the top of the force plate. A negative number would be them pointed more left. A positive number would be them pointed more right. And in the middle number, the green number is super important. This is our line of pressure. And this is just a line that's connecting the left center of pressure point to the right center of pressure. And we'll get into that a little bit more about what we want to see from that in a few moments. Now we're going to go ahead and just take a look at this golfer and analyze a little bit of her center of pressure trace and talk about some of the key important things we want to see. So I think one of the first things that's really important here is just where is that center of pressure kind of at address? And one of the main things I'm looking at is it's nice in the balls of her feet. Kind of what you would want to see from an athletic posture position, getting ready to make a dynamic move.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's cool there, Tyler, too. You can see because she's pushing from both sides in the balls of your feet, you see a very flat line of pressure, right? Signifying that she's pushing from roughly the same location in each foot of that address position.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess kind of one of the next points would be kind of this max pressure transfer into the trail foot. What do you like to see there?
Again, I find that in our best players, we tend to see them really build a lot of that pressure towards the trail side early in that swing, right? Kind of getting to that P2, P3 type position, right? Arm parallel on the backswing. Let's see that pressure kind of build, get that max pressure on the trail side, and then what they choose to do with it after that might be entirely up to them, but I think in really good players, that shift really helps a lot.
Absolutely. So you can see for this player, for example, right here, kind of arms parallel on the backswing or P3, they reach 81% pressure distribution into their trail side. And then actually from there, it starts going down, which is good. So we're getting a max pressure transfer into the trail side around P3, a nice and early point in the swing. The next point I guess we would get to is probably the top of the swing. And this is where we really start to talk about that line of pressure.
Yep.
Talk to me a little bit about that.
Again, line of pressure, remember, is this idea of the relationship between where they're pushing on the trail and where they're pushing on the lead. And for players who especially want to create a lot of rotational force right in that horizontal plane, they have to be able to be pushing from a little bit more towards the heel on the trail side or that red dot compared to what they're doing on the lead side or the blue dot. And that gives you that nice kind of positive right to left slope, which will give you a positive line of pressure value. It just sets them up really nicely to utilize some of these mechanical advantages to create a lot of that horizontal plane rotational force in the swing.
Yeah, so at the top of the swing, we always want to see a line of pressure that's tilted at least a little bit positive.
A little bit, yeah.
You can imagine if that line was tilted more to the left or negative, how that could lead to some club mechanics that we don't like so much, getting the club over the top and so on. The next point I'd like to talk about, I think, is probably just this early in the downswing. We really want to see the center of pressure in the lead foot, the blue for the right-handed golfer, really land into the ball of their foot pretty early. What's the reason for that?
I mean, one, it's a really powerful place to push vertically, which is what we need that lead foot to do. But we also have to remember some of the other things that the lead foot needs to do as well. And again, it just sets everything up really nicely. It sets everything up nicely to really maximize that push from the lead side. And again, we can see what happens is that overall center of pressure, that yellow dot, is starting to migrate more towards that lead foot as well. And we can see this kind of maximum pressure to the lead side start to appear early in the downswing, right? We don't want that to be late in the downswing.
Yeah. And then obviously after that, as most good golfers do, they kind of land into the heel of their lead foot as they finish their swing. Let's just talk real quickly about kind of the gross movement of that yellow center of pressure point, as well as the feet. I think we'll find that different players, it's quite different. And for a while, we kind of thought that everyone should have a similar pressure trace. And let's talk maybe about some of the different ones you may see or expect to see from different players.
Yeah, and that center of pressure trace, remember, we're talking about what that yellow kind of line and dot do, how they migrate through the swing dynamically, because it is such a dynamic movement. And I think Tyler explained it really well, where you're going to have players that have some different ways that they like to feel stability, which allows them to then create really nice forces in the swing. And so you may have a player that's a real lateral player, and you might find that they're a little bit wider in their stance. They tend to like to create some of these motions in their feet as they kind of move back and forth. And they might end up having kind of a line of pressure that remains relatively flat. Again, we want to see it a little bit positive because we know everyone's going to need to create some rotation in the swing. But again, a little bit wider, and those individual center of pressures maybe migrating a little bit on that individual foot. That might be a lateral player. We might see a vertical player, and I see this a lot with our kind of up-and-coming generation of golfers. It might be because they've seen a lot of these vertical center mass displacements. They tend to stay really in the balls of the feet, right? They don't tend to migrate back towards the heels at all. We'll see those individual center pressures, and again, that total center of pressure, the yellow dot, stay up near the balls of the feet because they're really pushing really, really hard through the balls of their feet, creating a lot of vertical force. And then you may have that kind of that big rotational player, that player who just really likes to generate things rotationally. And if that's the case, then we're going to definitely see that big positive line of pressure value. We're going to see that trail foot red dot sink a little bit further back, even migrating to the middle of the foot. We're going to see that blue dot from the lead foot go still up towards the ball of the foot. And it's going to create that big angle at the line of pressure that's going to allow them to leverage those relationships of those feet to create a ton of rotational force. And what I think is important, Tyler, with these is golfers, they may be doing the thing that their body wants them to be the most stable in, but they for sure might not be. And so this is one of those things where I just always really encourage coaches and players to try a few things, right? Get your player on there and have them try and move in that lateral direction. Have them try and create some heel-to-toe forces. Have them try and push from the balls of their feet and start to look at the data and start to talk to that player and talk about how they feel stability and if they feel powerful in that position. because that can be a really great way to make sure that your player is actually doing the thing that they should be doing, instead of just saying, hey, I need this Z trace because that's the best trace I can have. It might be for players, but for other players, they might have a totally different way of creating stability in the swing with their feet that allows them to set up to create a lot of powerful ground reaction forces.
So I think just to kind of summarize what we just talked a little bit about, this idea of having kind of different traces, you know, for that lateral player, you might see that yellow center of pressure dot really migrate quite a lot laterally. You'll see a long kind of flat migration of that yellow center of pressure. Whereas with that more rotational player, you might see it kind of arc a little bit more, like we've shown in some of these graphics. And then the vertical player, they'll probably still have a little bit of movement into the trail side on that yellow center of pressure, but it's going to stay kind of more put in the same spot. So I think you'll see the way that each foot really impacts that. Obviously, for more of an arcing one, you'll see it move more into the heel of the trail foot, and maybe not so much on the lateral ones. But I think you really nailed something there. It's really important to kind of play around with these and help a player figure out, you know, what happens when I change a foot flare or a stance alignment. Do you want to talk a little bit about maybe some of the common things we've seen with a couple of those?
Yeah, for sure. And I think big ones are how the feet kind of interact with the rest of the body, right? And so I think kind of a basic one I've seen a lot is players who really struggle to create the rotation they need in the trail side. Sometimes that just comes from a lack of mobility. So sometimes you can cheat that really easily with that foot flare. And if for whatever reason you maybe have that player that you want to increase that foot flare out, you can look at that positive value and say, hey, let's work on this. And you might be thinking that they're doing it, but you can actually measure it right on here and say, hey, we increase your foot flare. You're a little more out pointed by 5 or 6 degrees. And that really helps you kind of do some things in the swing that you really like. I think in some of the vertical players who tend to stay in the balls of their feet, having them also have the capacity to create some nice rotation is also important. So even something a little bit with that stance alignment where you know, I'm not going to severely drop that trail foot, but even if I just subtly move those a little bit, that can be an effective way to actually create that line of pressure without having them diminish this superpower that they have, right?
Yeah.
Taking away the ability they have to push in the balls of their feet.
Sure.
And then I love what you said about the lateral player and the stance width, right? If you have a player who really likes to do lateral things, man, getting them a little bit wider in the stance to help improve their lateral forces. I don't know if I've ever seen a player who couldn't benefit from a little more stance width if they're trying to create better, more appropriate lateral forces.
Absolutely. I think the last thing we want to do in this video is just talk a little bit more about the difference between pressure and force. So we have a couple examples of what might look like some pretty good pressure distribution or pressure traces, but maybe don't look so good on the force. So the first example is unfortunately going to be myself. And if we look at the pressure distribution and the pressure traces, overall we're pretty good at those. But you can see here that, you know, I'm not creating very good vertical force. So maybe talk to me just a little bit
and I think it's
about
cool, right? If you go to maybe like, I don't know, P6-ish on the downswing, right? Arm kind of parallel on the downswing, somewhere in that age, right? We look at the pressure distribution, right? And we have a lot on the blue side, right? A lot on the lead side, very little on the trail side. And so we might look at that really quickly and say, hey, Tyler, you've done a great job at getting pressure to the lead side at appropriate times of the swing. And you for sure are, right? And that would be something that would be really important. But as we dive a little bit deeper and go to the maximum vertical force at that time, we get a maximum vertical force value that's sitting in the, you know, barely over 100% value, right? Because again, pressure is not measuring force. It's just measuring the distribution of that pressure. And so again, pressure looks great, but now I'm going to look at you and say, man, if I could get that same pressure distribution, good timings, but crank up that vertical force, I'd stand the chance to really help you improve some efficiencies and power in the swing.
Absolutely. You can see here that, you know, again, obviously pretty low vertical force, good pressure distribution. That point of application is really far in my heel, so not good. So pressure can tell part of the story, but it doesn't necessarily tell the full story.
For sure.
I think another great example is a player we often see, sometimes players in their downswing, where it looks like their pressure goes way back into their trail side, the total pressure. And just explain to me kind of what that is showing.
This is a good example, right? Again, it's the difference between pressure and force and pressure and weight, right? If we see that pressure trace where all of a sudden that yellow dot goes flying back to the trail side, even maybe a little bit before impact, and you're thinking, wait a second, did that player just shift all of their weight to the trail side before they hit the ball? That would be a really kind of silly thing for that player to do, for lack of a better word, right? Because you don't want them to do that, right? We want them to build and build that force. We want them to build that pressure on the side. So this is kind of a cool example of it, where when you look at this player and you look at his pressure trace, again, his overall pressure trace, when you go to kind of just before impact, what you start to see is that yellow dots start to flash back to the trail side, right? But the reason why it's happening is when you kind of zero in on his lead foot. This is a player who was a vertical player. They generated so much vertical force from the lead side that their foot actually comes off the ground. And the fastest way for me to shift my pressure is to just lift a foot off the ground. Because when I lift the foot off the ground, every bit of my pressure is going to go to the trail side. And again, it doesn't mean that I shifted all my weight to the backside. It just means that I pushed so hard from the lead side. Foot leaves the ground, pressure goes back, and that's not going to be something I'm going to want to fix in this golfer, right? He's using the ground very beautifully in this swing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that gives us a good start on pressure and all the things you can see in the app, some of the things to expect to see. We obviously look forward in future videos and so on to dig even more into this and how to kind of tackle it from a coaching perspective. But hopefully now everyone can at least look in the app and understand what they're seeing and a little bit of what they would hope to see.